What's up, Mets fans? Welcome back to the channel. It is officially the Mets off season as the MLB playoffs began yesterday with a couple of exciting games, but not as exciting as if the Mets were to be in the playoffs. We are talking about the off season and some internal free agent candidates that David Stearns and this front office are going to have to weigh in on in terms of whether they bring back or they let go as it pertains to free agency. We have some player options, some club options to talk about. But before we fully get into it, smash those thumbs up buttons, subscribe to the channel for all your Mets offseason content needs. We're going to be talking about free agent targets, trade targets. When the winter meetings come around, we're going to be going live for the winter meetings as well, talking about all things Mets here in the offseason. You don't want to miss out because this is going to be a very interesting and busy offseason for David Stearns, who took to the microphone in his first press conference after the Mets were officially eliminated from playoff contention, talking about run prevention, talking about the need to be more aggressive in certain areas of this team, and a lot more things that David Stearns was talking to this fan base about. But the main point being 2025 was a failure and it was unacceptable based off of the standards that the Mets have established under Steve Cohen and now David Stearns. We all know that. So let's get into the interesting part of this episode, talking about the internal free agent candidates, because as you can tell on this slide right here, the Mets already have some news about some potential free agents hitting the open market and testing free agency that were on the 2025 New York Mets roster. Of the handful of players, these might be a little bit less interesting, but Jose Siri, Richard Lovelady, and Kevin Herget all elected free agency after being DFA'd by the New York Mets in the previous weeks. And this is a common theme that we are going to be talking about here in the first couple of weeks of this offseason as David Stearns tries to strategize how to reconstruct this roster, because even outside of these three names, there are a lot bigger names that we will have to make decisions on. And David Stearns, I should say, will have to make decisions on. And let's get into that. Let's get into the outlook right here. As you can see up top, the estimated payroll in 2026 for the New York Mets is starting out around $228.5 million. Now, that's according to Spotrac, and it's very important because that figure right there takes into account all the arbitration estimates and figures of arbitration eligible players. It takes into account player options, club options, all that in between. And we'll talk about that here in just a second. As you can see down below on this slide, all the players and their associated statuses moving forward into this offseason for the New York Mets. The two biggest ones are highlighted in green, with Pete Alonso officially stating, wasting no time, by the way, after that Marlins series where the Mets were eliminated, directly going into the locker room and saying, yes, I will be opting out of this contract with the New York Mets. Was talking in past tense, as if you missed my video, the previous video on this channel, I'll link that in the description down below, just talking about my raw emotions on how big of a failure this season was and how big this offseason upcoming is going to be for this team to try to get back on track to being World Series contenders in 2026. But also Edwin Diaz, who has a player option associated, and we are anxiously awaiting whether or not he is going to opt out of his contract because he had another monster season for the New York Mets. And I'll just say this up front, I'll be very shocked if he does not opt out of this deal. Yes, Edwin Diaz was a little bit more, I guess, conservative in his approach with how he talked about his contract status versus Pete Alonso. Edwin Diaz, on the other hand, was like, I'd love to come back to the New York Mets. The Mets have treated me well, and I enjoy playing here. That's kind of what I was hoping Pete Alonso would say, but he was much more aggressive in the fact that he was going to be opting out of his contract. So the Pete Alonso saga is going to start up very shortly. There's going to be so many teams in on Pete Alonso, and as we'll get into Pete Alonso more in the next slide, I really wanted to talk about Edwin Diaz because, I think it would be crazy for him not to opt out of this deal with the New York Mets. Yes, he loves the organization and this fan base loves him. I'm sure this organization, with how big of a contributor he has been over the course of his entire Mets tenure loves him equally. But financially, the best decision for Edwin Diaz in terms of long-term contract revenue to maximize his earnings is to opt out of his deal after having such a great season and continuing to build that strength after, the injury that kept him out all 2023 long. 2024 was not up to his standards completely. It was a relatively okay season, but not up to the Edwin Diaz standards. In 2025, he got right back on track to his all-star caliber season that he posted in 2022. So I am fully expecting Edwin Diaz to opt out. And it depends on what he is looking for. He's clearly going to be, wanting to be one of the highest paid closers in baseball, as he deserves that. But is David Stearns going to offer up that kind of money when the Mets have so many other holes on this roster as it pertains to the bullpen? And as you can tell with the rest of this list, right, the bullpen is the biggest uncertainty outside of who's going to be playing first base for this team moving forward in 2026, because there are so many free agents hitting the open market that were present in the 2025 Mets bullpen. As you can see right here, AJ Minter has a player option. Now, I do think AJ Minter will opt into his deal. He missed the majority of the 2025 season. The Mets had high hopes for him to be a regular contributor in this bullpen in 2025, and that simply didn't work out. I do think that he will take that deal and opt into it and try to prove himself in 2026 before hitting the open market after this next season. They have a club option on Brooks Raley. I fully expect the Mets to exercise that club option on Brooks Raley as well. And he was fantastic for the 2025 Mets down the stretch of the second half of the season after he came back from the injured list. Brooks Raley will be a part of this bullpen. I have no doubt in my mind about that. But then you take a look at the rest of the list. Helsley, Rogers, Soto, and Stanek, all unrestricted free agents. Reed Garrett will be back. Edwin Diaz's status is unknown. So you're really talking about, 3 to 4, contributors in this bullpen and, mainstays in this bullpen. Brazaban's going to be back. We know that. Dylan Ross, who we saw getting called up in the last series of the season, is going to be a, I guess, contributor for this team and seeing if he can crack the bullpen out of spring training. But the rest of the bullpen, remaking this bullpen is going to be priority number one for David Stearns, I would have to imagine, especially given some of the young talent that is already on this roster from a rotation perspective. But I think priority number 2 and 3 equally, right, in terms of order of importance, is going to be making a decision on Pete Alonso and also trying to get an ace into this rotation that is not named Kodai Senga or Sean Manaea. David Peterson and this idea that he is an ace for any team is long out the window. He is going to be a solid number 3 or number 4 option for this team. Kodai Senga's future with this team in 2026 is also in doubt. If there is any way to move Kodai Senga, I am positive that David Stearns will look into all routes of doing that, given the disappointing second half of the season that Senga had, and not even being an option for this team when this team needed him the most in 2025. So, and you can tell the rest of the list here. Griffin Canning, I don't think is going to be brought back. Jesse Winker's Mets days are over. Jose Siri's not coming back. And I don't think Starling Marte is going to come back. There is a good chance that he does, though, right? My objective mind is like, all right, we want to create the most roster spots as possible. But if Starling Marte comes back as a bench bat, I will not be mad. But if he is a candidate to be in another platoon DH role, then I don't want Starling Marte back. I think that this platoon DH business needs to stop in 2026, and the Mets need to make one decision and one decision only for DH in 2026 and beyond. And that's the bottom line. I've been saying that for quite some time, and that's just how I view the Mets needing to prioritize that spot in the lineup. That has been a weakness for this Mets organization ever since the DH was introduced in the National League. But let's get into the juiciest part of this podcast episode. And again, this is episode 1, so we're not getting into any external free agents. We're only talking internal to the Mets right now. As this offseason progresses, it's still very early. We will talk about upcoming external free agent candidates to make this roster better from the perspective and the mindset of David Stearns. But Pete Alonso, there's a lot of split opinions within this Mets fan base on the future status of Pete Alonso in Queens. He is coming off of a career year in multiple aspects. The defensive part of his game needs work, clearly. I mean, especially with the throwing, a handful of errors on Pete Alonso. You talk about the throw that sent Kodai Senga up into the air that changed the trajectory of this season, multiple throws home and to second base for Pete Alonso that were errant. But nonetheless, Pete Alonso with the bat, which is what you expect the type of production level from Pete Alonso to be, was nothing short of amazing, especially in comparison to his 2024 season. And in the beginning of 2025, the first month or so, he was the single New York Met that was carrying the offense, it seemed like, when they needed him the most, and the pitching was holding up their ends of the bargain. 272 batting average collectively. If you enjoy the batting average stat, if that matters to you, that is a career high for Pete Alonso. An 871 OPS. He didn't quite get to that 131 RBI mark, but he was not far off at 126. Another 35 plus home run season with 38 home runs and 41 doubles for Pete Alonso, contributing to that 871 OPS, which was by far a career high for him, hitting the ball in the gap. And you can see the market value in which Spotrac has calculated for him in this upcoming free agency. And that is estimated to be 6 years, $176.58 million, coming in at just around $29.5 million as an annual average salary AAV. Is David Stearns going to pony up that kind of money, or are they going to rely on external options and internal options? We're talking about maybe Mark Vientos if he sticks around in this organization, which I don't think should be the backup option, but maybe another guy, a prospect like Ryan Clifford, who was just promoted in the tail end of the season to AAA and had some success there. Is he an internal option to step up and replace Pete Alonso at first base if Alonso walks? But I do think if the Mets have it in their minds, Steve Cohen, David Stearns coming to this agreement that Pete Alonso needs to remain a New York Met, and he proved enough in 2025 in order to get this type of money, then I think that the Mets are clear favorites to re-sign him. But given how the contract negotiation worked out between Boris Alonso and the Mets camp, there's a lot of uncertainty in my mind whether Pete Alonso will be a New York Met in 2026. I was a lot more confident last offseason than I am this offseason because he posted the numbers and some team is going to give him this market value, maybe even just a little bit north of that to secure him at first base for their respective team. Now, teams that are going to be in the running, I mean, we can think the crosstown rival Yankees, who are actually down 1-0 in their series to the Boston Red Sox right now, are in the market for a first baseman. And I don't even want to I'm doing this right off the rip here. I don't want to even think about any other teams that will be in the market for a first baseman. I know the Giants are going to be one. A handful of teams would love Pete Alonso on their roster, just like the New York Mets would, and teams that have money to spend and are waiting to spend it. So there's a lot of holes on the Mets going into 2026. I will say that. And first base is going to be the biggest indicator of how they're going to allocate their money and their payroll. $228.5 million is a pretty steep number to start off with. Again, that's just an estimate. That's not the concrete number. It's reliant on the arbitration values, etc. But David Stearns, with the amount of talent that he needs to acquire to go alongside the already established core on the offensive side, and also the young guys from the pitching side of things with Jonah Tong, Brandon Sproat, and Nolan McLean, I'm curious how he distributes the wealth across this roster. And that's something that we also will be talking about, I'm sure, with Rob and myself when we team up together for some off-season streams here in the near future on both of our channels. So, Mets fans, let me know what you think about this Pete Alonso saga part 2 that's coming up this off-season. Do you want to see Pete Alonso back in a Mets uniform for a price similar to this that you see on your screen? Would you rather the Mets just rely on somebody else externally, a lot of different things to consider here for the Mets and for us fans in terms of how we would like to see David Stearns approach this offseason. I hope you all enjoyed this podcast episode. I definitely appreciate it. Spam those thumbs up buttons for me. 100%. We'll be back very soon talking about more offseason plans and talking points for the New York Mets. See you all later. Peace.